Talk is a voyage with a purpose, and the purpose must be charted. A person who starts out going nowhere usually gets there. Dale Carnegie. Welcome to Session 7. The first of 2 sessions we'll devote to the importance of assertive communication. It's no secret that the ability to communicate well is an essential people skill. That's always been true, but what's involved in good communication is always changing, especially in corporate settings. Years ago, for example, there were far fewer women in the business world than there are today. Communication was largely a male-to-male experience. But now, in a much more diverse workplace, there are many new issues to be aware of in all forms of business communication. What's more, the introduction of new technologies such as email, voicemail, text messaging, and cell phones have created whole new categories of communication. These technologies have hugely increased the pace and efficiency of business contact, but they've also brought hugely expanded possibilities for mistakes and misunderstandings. We'll be looking at these changes and many other related topics in this session and in the one that follows. Here in Session 7, our discussion will focus on speaking, both in one-on-one encounters and in meetings and presentations. In Session 8, we'll concentrate on assertive listening. Listening is definitely one of the most undervalued people skills, and it deserves a session of its own. In any field of endeavor, there is an important difference between participation and competence. Someone may be able to speak the English language, but this doesn't mean that he can be effective as a professional speaker. Another person may be capable of writing complete sentences, but that alone won't enable her to get a book published. With this distinction in mind, the first step toward effective, assertive communication is understanding that this really is a skill. Just talking is not communication, nor is just writing. These are areas that require attention, practice, and continuous improvement. They take work, especially when you're just starting to realize the importance of good communication to your success in a management role. It may surprise you to realize that even seemingly casual conversation should be handled carefully in a corporate setting, but this is simply a fact of life. So often, something is said in an informal context, and only later does it become clear that this was the cause of a misunderstanding. In general, most business conversations more or less drift along. As a manager, you need to strike a balance between friendly communication and efficient, assertive sharing of information. If you're planning on a more or less formal conversation for a significant purpose, you'll first need to clearly identify that purpose in your own mind. You need to plan for achieving it in a face-to-face encounter. True, some people are good at thinking on their feet, but this is generally because they already have a clear understanding of the context and their own goals. Most of us need a plan, however, and as you do so, here are 3 key points to bear in mind. First, you need to make sure that your message is understood. Second, you must understand what is being said to you, even if the speaker is not an especially good communicator. We'll have much more to say about this element when we discuss the topic of assertive listening. And third, you need to keep control of the conversation. Make sure the necessary points are addressed and pertinent questions are effectively addressed. And needless to say, all this should take place within a reasonable time frame. In order to understand how these points can be satisfied, we need to look at what actually takes place when people talk with one another. It's much more of a creative process than you might have realized. The process includes not only understanding what is actually being said, but also grasping the speaker's motives, his implicit but unspoken messages, and any irony or sarcasm that could run completely counter to the explicit meaning of the words. In short, there's a lot going on when people try to communicate. By using easy-to-follow, unambiguous language and tone of voice, you can make it easier for others to understand exactly what you're thinking, feeling, and wanting. This is equally valuable whether you're trying to solve a problem with a team member or expressing appreciation or concern. Expressing yourself carefully might appear to take longer than a quick style of communication, but factor in the time required to unscramble misunderstandings and to work through the feelings that usually accompany not being understood. When you do this, you'll see that expressing yourself more carefully can actually save you time and perhaps save money for your company as well. If you observe people in conversation, you'll begin to notice that human communication typically leaves many things unsaid. It depends on the listener to fill in the missing but implied information. For example, an assistant may say to an executive, "Your 2 o'clock is here." If we rely only on what's being directly said, this statement makes no sense at all. Of course, the assistant means your client who made an appointment for 2 o'clock has arrived in the waiting room, and the executive knows that. Most of the time, of course, this abbreviating process works very well, but in situations of change, ambiguity, conflict, or intense deadline pressure, the shorthand way of speaking may not work at all. There are several reasons for this. For instance, your listeners may fill in a completely different set of details than the one you intended, or they may not understand the significance of what you're saying. They may get only some of the details, but still miss the big picture. Or without actually intending to mislead anyone, you may leave out important elements because of the reactions you think they will elicit. Since misunderstanding can be very costly both personally and professionally, you need to help your listeners by giving them a complete picture in language that doesn't confuse or mislead them. Research has shown that there are 5 main tools that your conversation partners can use to recreate your experience inside their minds. The more elements you provide for them, the higher the probability that your listener's recreation will match the message you wish to convey. Let's look at the tools one by one. First, what have you seen, heard, or otherwise experienced that you want to convey to your listener? Here it's important to stick to just the facts. What happened or what didn't happen? When did it happen? Or when was it supposed to happen? For example, "I got your memo this morning about the new client in Florida." Or, "I haven't yet received the report on the latest customer survey. I think we agree that that was due last Thursday." Second, what feelings do the facts bring out in you? Obviously, in a business setting, you'll be dealing with a relatively narrow range of emotions. You might be pleased about something that's happened, or excited about something that's going to happen, or disappointed about something that you thought would happen, but didn't. An example might be, "I'm really happy that you handled the situation so smoothly," or, "When a shipment gets lost like this, I begin to lose confidence in the way we fill our orders." Third, what interpretations, wants, needs, memories, or anticipations of yours support those feelings? Once again, a business conversation is different from delivering a toast at your daughter's wedding. There's no need to become emotional, but you can and should share some of what you experience as a manager, dealing with many different people and projects. If your company is having problems with a new voicemail system, for example, you might mention that the savings that result from an automated system might not really be cost-efficient. If potential clients become frustrated by talking with a machine and hang up, there could be an argument for having a live phone receptionist. You might mention the fact that more business is lost because of an unsatisfactory phone experience than for any other reason. Next, what action, information, or commitment do you want now? This is really the key segment of the conversation. This is what you've been leading up to, and this is where you want to be an assertive communicator in the best possible sense. It's best if you introduce what you're going to say in a more or less formal manner, so it will be clear to the listener that this is the time to pay attention. The best way to do this is with a very simple phrase, "May I make a suggestion?" There's simply no better way to say it. In fact, if you always say, "May I make a suggestion?" it will almost become a conditioned reflex for team members to perk up their ears. Then you're in a position to give a directive in a very positive context because you've asked permission to do so. Finally, always include a benefit-oriented conclusion with any suggestion you might make. So a typical sequence could go something like this. "I'm glad to hear you were able to close that sale over the phone. It's really much more efficient to do that than to have a face-to-face meeting. May I make a suggestion? When it looks like the client wants a live sales call, ask if you can handle it over the phone. provided, of course, that your relationship with the client is already well established. If you can do that, your commissions are bound to go up because you'll be making more sales in a shorter period of time. This 5-part template is a hugely powerful tool for effectively assertive business conversations. It's so simple and logical, yet very few people are able to discover it on their own. Typically, managers lead off with point number 2, the feelings that are being aroused in them, and often they do so in a very inappropriate manner. This is especially true when the feelings are negative. I get really angry when something like this happens. In one form or another, this phrase is spoken literally thousands of times every day in companies across the country. But what does it really convey? The emphasis is on what the manager is feeling, while the real emphasis should be on the business issue at hand. The 5 assertive conversation tools we've just discussed can be very effective, but they're not the end of a one-on-one business communication. It's always a good idea to ask for confirmation that what you've said has been clearly understood. It's also a good idea to ask in a diplomatic way for any reservations or objections. The truth is, those objections are almost always present, but they won't surface unless you ask for them. When speaking yourself, you can make an effort to deal with objections in advance by adding information that will make your message better understood. By the same token, when others are speaking, you should deliberately ask questions yourself to establish the context of their thinking. If there are no questions on the part of either you or your listeners, there's a good chance that the communication will be less than ideal. This is really an important point. As managers move up the corporate ladder to senior executive positions, it's easy for them to believe that everyone admires and agrees with them. Ideally, this is really the case, but it may also be that team members are simply afraid to speak their minds. As a manager, you should assume that people have something to question or add to what you've told them. If those opinions are not made available to you, you should likewise assume that you have not successfully completed the conversation. In this sense, an assertive business talk is like a sales call. Unless the customer's objections are brought to the surface, buyer's remorse will almost always set in, and there may be negative repercussions later. So don't let your ego convince you that everything has been understood and accepted. In fact, you should operate on the opposite assumption. Once you've heard the objections to your message, you should use a basic technique of interpersonal dynamics. That is, you should repeat and confirm what you've just heard. Once again, there's a very simple way to move toward this in one sentence. Just say, "Let me be sure I understand what you're saying." Then repeat what you've just been told, not word for word, but in a slightly different form. Rephrase what your team member has communicated in a way that shows you've heard it, understood it, and thoughtfully evaluated it. Keep in mind also that it's not always necessary to deal with objections at the very moment that you first hear them. Give yourself some time to respond in the best possible way. The main thing is, first, to bring the objections to the surface, and secondly, to show that you understand them and take them seriously. State your message, ask questions that bring out objections, then make sure that you understand and respect them. If in your judgment a conversation has dealt with substantial issues, take the time to make a written record of what transpired and email it to the appropriate parties. Surprisingly, this is almost more important for encounters that take place at the water cooler than for full-blown meetings in a conference room. Sometimes very important decisions are made spontaneously and with little fanfare. New ideas can be introduced. Seeds can be planted that, if handled correctly, can develop into important projects. Writing an email message in this context is one of the best uses of the new information technologies. It's a way of quickly creating and circulating a reminder that probably will never become tremendously significant, but there's always a chance that it might. And there are other benefits as well. Your email can provide or ask for further clarification. In other words, is this what we discussed and agreed upon? And in writing down your thoughts, you may recognize questions or omissions that were overlooked in the initial conversation. Even if you use all the tools and techniques we've been discussing, there are still times when conversations will turn into confrontation and conflict. Let's face this reality very directly by looking once again at what assertiveness really means. To assert, according to one dictionary, means to declare or to state clearly. This should always be your aim. Assertiveness doesn't mean winning. It doesn't mean scoring more conversational points. If people argue with you or even lose their tempers, just remain calmly assertive. As you do so, here's another template you can use for guidance. The template has two parts. First, acknowledge what is being said by showing an understanding of the other party's position, or simply rephrasing it as we discussed earlier. In the context of a heated discussion, this is a polite way of saying, "I heard you already." Then, state your own point of view clearly and concisely with a little supporting evidence, but not as if you were building a case in a court of law. Then say what you want to happen next. This is a way of moving the discussion forward rather than continuing to fight it out on the same ground. Without doubt, there will be times when very forceful argument on your part will bring a positive outcome, but there will also be times when this will get nowhere, particularly with people who simply don't want to listen. Sometimes these will be subordinates, but not infrequently you'll be stonewalled by senior management. In that case, you should agree to the decision of the senior manager, but you should also make your objections and your reasons clearly known. After all, you think you're in the right, so say so, and allow your team members the same freedom. Always be that someone who disagrees. You might actually be correct. If events prove it to be the case, acknowledge that fact gracefully. If and when you have a difficult encounter, be professional. Don't lose your self-control, even if you want to make it appear that you've done exactly that. If you deliberately seem to lose your temper for effect, make that a conscious decision. Remember that insults are fundamentally ineffective. Calling people names is just distracting. They are unlikely to actually listen to what you have to say. In the short term, you may feel some satisfaction or excitement, but this comes at the price of a prolonged and intensified argument. As a corollary to this, it should be emphasized that profanity should not be a part of assertive communication. This is less an issue of morality than of simple human nature. If certain words are included in a conversation, particularly with an angry tone, those become the hot words, the only words that the listener really hears. In this sense, profanity actually undermines the content of your message. And of course, to many people, it's truly distasteful. So if you feel you really need to blow your top, just say, "Dad blasted." That way you may seem old and out of date, but at least you won't be offensive. So far, we've focused on spoken communications between one person and another. For the balance of this session, we'll look at group communications of the kind that occur in meetings and presentations. In any company, meetings are a vital part to the assignment of work and the flow of information. Meetings are the vehicle for gathering resources from many sources and directing them toward a common goal. Yet meetings are widely disliked. Most people feel they're usually futile, boring, time-wasting, dull, and inconvenient. As a manager, your challenge is to break this perception and to make your meetings effective. As with every other significant form of communication, meetings should be planned ahead of time, carefully directed while they are in progress, and reviewed afterwards for what went well and what could be improved. Really, a meeting is the ultimate form of managed conversation within a business setting. If you can gain a reputation for holding decisive, effective meetings, your team members will value this efficiency and prepare well so that their contribution will be heard. At the same time, your supervisors will take notice of your work in this often difficult area. For any meeting, the first question is always, who should attend? Be strict. A meeting loses its effectiveness if too many people are involved. If someone insists on attending, explain that it's not really necessary and politely but firmly dissuade them. Actually, most people are only too happy to be released from another meeting. How long should you plan for the meeting to last? It may seem difficult to predict the length of a meeting, but you must try to do so. Conversations tend to fill the available time, so if the meeting is open-ended, it will drift on forever. You should designate a time for the end of the meeting so that everyone can plan the rest of the day with confidence. Make the time limit for the meeting known in advance to everyone who will attend, and remind them at the beginning of the meeting. Often there's a tendency to view meetings as a bit of relaxation, since no one person has to be active throughout. You can change this view by emphasizing the time limit. This is what we have to accomplish. This is how long we have to get it done. If an important new topic arises unexpectedly during the discussion, stay with the planned agenda. The new topic should then be dealt with at a separate meeting. The purpose of a meeting agenda is to inform participants of the subject of the meeting in advance and to structure the discussion of the meeting itself. To inform people beforehand and to solicit ideas, circulate a draft agenda and ask for comments. Then create a revised agenda and get it back to the participants as soon as possible. The final agenda states the purpose of each section of the meeting. There should be an objective for each section. If that objective can't be summarized in a few points, then it's probably too complex. The purpose of the meeting should be sufficiently precise that it can be summarized in a brief heading at the top of the printed agenda. While the meeting is in progress, you as the manager must assertively coordinate the contributions of everyone present. The degree of control which you exercise over the meeting can vary throughout. If things get off on the right foot, a meeting can run itself, especially if the participants know each other well. But you must always be ready to step in to complete the meeting objectives. The purpose of a meeting may suggest a specific way for conducting the event. For example, if the purpose is to share information, the meeting might begin with a formal presentation followed by questions. If the purpose is to seek information on how to deal with a specific issue, it might start with a short statement of the problem, and then an open discussion or a brainstorming session. If the goal of the meeting is to arrive at a decision of some kind, the group might review the options, establish the criteria to be applied, agree on how the decision should be made, and then proceed to make it. Bear in mind that the success of a meeting often depends on the confidence level of the participants. All pertinent ideas should be welcome. No one should be laughed at or dismissed, and even weak ideas should be treated seriously. All these guidelines should be diligently followed in the spirit of assertive communication and good people skills. In closing this discussion of spoken communication and people skills, it's interesting to note just how basic this issue is to human success. The biblical story of the Tower of Babel is a good illustration of this. No one knows exactly how this story originated or when it was written down, but it depicts a civilization's attempt to construct an edifice so tall that it could actually reach the heavens. Despite the unlikeliness of this undertaking, the Bible tells us that the project was a success. The tower was getting higher and higher with no sign of slowing down. But this, of course, was not the way that mankind was ordained to enter paradise. Therefore, the Creator undertook to bring the project to an end. But this did not require bolts of lightning or an earthquake. The Creator simply introduced the idea of language into the world. People could no longer understand what they were saying to one another, and progress on the Tower of Babel came to a halt. While you may not think of your company as a medium for getting to heaven, it is a collective enterprise that depends completely on good communication. If you and your team members can't share ideas in a proactive and supportive manner, nothing else really matters. Failure to communicate spells doom for any shared enterprise. On the other hand, as the Tower of Babel story seems to indicate, literally anything is possible when people are able to work together. By keeping that in mind whenever you speak with your team members, you can accomplish more than you ever imagined. We've now reached the end of Session 7 in our exploration of assertive people skills. In Session 8, we'll continue our discussion of communication by devoting the entire session to the power of listening. Please listen in. This is one of the most basic facts of human psychology. We are flattered by other people's attention. It makes us feel special. We want to be around people who show interest in us. We want to keep them close, and we tend to reciprocate their interest by showing interest in them. Dale Carnegie. Welcome to Session 8, where our topic is assertive listening. Listening is an art, a skill, a discipline, and like other skills, it needs self-control. As a manager, you must understand what is involved in listening and develop the necessary techniques to be silent and pay attention to what you're hearing. You must learn to ignore your own needs and concentrate attention on the person speaking. Hearing becomes listening only when you pay attention to what is said and follow it very closely. So without question, listening is an absolutely essential people skill. Research shows that most people spend 70% of their waking hours interacting with other human beings in some way, shape, or form, and 45% of that time is spent listening. As with any activity in which you devote a large part of your day, it's better to be good at it than not good. Assertive listening is being good at it. And the first step in this direction is to understand what really goes on in a human conversational interaction. Analogies are never perfect, but there is an analogy that comes extremely close to precisely and exactly explaining what goes on when people speak and listen. It's an analogy between human communication and driving a car, or rather driving your car in traffic. Almost certainly you've never met most of the people who are in the cars all around you. But when your cars arrive at a stop sign together, it's understood that everyone will stop. By the rules of the road, the car on the right has the right of way, and most people respect this. They let the car on the right proceed into the intersection first. Sometimes people even give a little wave to urge the other driver forward, and usually the other driver will give a little wave of thanks in return. This is just how it all works, and after people have been driving for a while, they understand the various protocols and abide by them. Of course, there are exceptions. Some people speed, others drive too slow. At stop signs, some people don't yield the right-of-way, and others may blow through the intersection without even stopping. This is extremely irresponsible and dangerous behavior, and there are penalties attached to it. There are traffic tickets and license suspensions, not to mention the possibility of a life-threatening accident. Although the stop signs and traffic signals are a little more subtle, a conversation works in basically the same way. You may not know the person you're speaking with, but experience has taught you that there are moments when it's your turn to listen and times when it's your turn to speak. There are no physical stop signs to indicate these places, but you've learned to sense them and respect them. Just as certain intersections can be complex and congested, conversations involving several people can require greater awareness on everyone's part. But even if there are 4 or 5 people talking, things can go smoothly if all parties obey the rules. Once again, however, there is the problem of people who don't obey the rules. There are conversational speeders, whose verbal RPM is always in overdrive. There are people who talk so slowly and softly that listening to them is like being stuck behind an old farmer in a pickup truck on a 2-lane country road. And there are even the really dangerous conversationalists who seem determined to cause accidents through rudeness and insensitivity. The unfortunate thing about these rule breakers is that there are no traffic cops to get them off the road, and they take full advantage of that fact. Since there's no law enforcement mechanism for verbal traffic patterns, they just indulge themselves to the fullest. When you're driving your car, the chances are you'd like to drive as fast as safely possible in order to get to your destination in the shortest time. You don't actually drive that fast, but maybe you do go 5 or 10 miles an hour above the speed limit on the interstate. What about when you're engaged in a conversation? Do you go 60 in the 55 zone? Do you come to a complete halt at the stop signs, or do you just slow down and glide through? Just as you may drive a bit above the speed limit, there's a high probability that you're more focused on talking than listening. To become an assertive listener, you first need to become aware of that tendency, and then you need to change it. We all want to speak, and we all want to be listened to. But do you know what it means to listen, to really listen? It's more than just hearing the words. It's truly understanding other people's messages, as well as their circumstances and feelings. This is the meaning of empathy, and empathy is a basic element of assertive listening. Empathy means understanding other people so well that, at least for the moment, you experience their feelings. It's listening so intently and identifying so closely that you experience the other person's situation, thoughts, and emotions. Good friends do this, so do good doctors, and so do good managers. Assertive empathic listening shows that you care and understand other people. When they sense this on your part, they'll naturally feel more comfortable and confident in their communication with you. They'll open up more. If they feel you've misunderstood them, they'll sense that it's okay to correct your impression, and as a result, you'll get a clearer and more accurate sense of what's really being said. In short, assertive listening lets you learn more about your team members. It cuts through the superficiality of conversation and brings out what's really on people's minds. As an assertive listener, you're able to direct the conversation toward important topics without ever needing to do so in a formal way. Since the speaker knows it's safe to talk about these subjects, he or she can express real feelings. This is not just good business practice on your part. It's genuinely caring behavior in a human sense. At first, assertive listening may require some focused attention and effort, but you'll quickly see that it actually makes business conversations easier. It can reduce the impatience that so often is a part of business interactions, and it can eliminate mistaken negative assumptions, because now you have a way of finding out what another person is really like. Assertive listening is one of the most important people skills you will ever acquire. It's amazing how few people do it well. Assertive listening, as we've discussed, is based on really wanting to know the other person, but it also depends on avoiding some very common conversational barriers. Let's look at a few of these right now. First, avoid constantly comparing yourself to the speaker. Most people don't come right out and say it, but when someone else is talking, their minds are filled with thoughts like, I can't wait for this guy to stop talking so that I can tell an anecdote of my own, which, by the way, is much more interesting than what I'm now hearing. This last tendency is very important. Once you become aware of it, you'll be amazed how often it turns up both in your own thoughts and in conversations you take part in. Zig Ziglar calls it playing topper. It's the impulse to immediately top the other person's story. Someone says, my plane was delayed in Chicago for 2 hours, and you immediately flash, I was delayed in Denver for 3 hours. He says, I broke my arm, and you think, I broke my leg. She tells you, I caught a big fish, and you're instantly scanning your memory for the biggest fish you ever caught, or maybe the biggest fish your brother-in-law caught, provided it was a really big one. That's what playing topper is all about. It's so common, I'm sure you recognize it right away, and I'm also sure that you see why it's the deadly enemy of assertive listening. A second barrier involves trying to mind read what the speaker actually thinks as different from what he's saying. If someone says, I really like working here, you interpret this to mean, he doesn't like working here, but he says that he does because he's afraid of losing his job. This is mind reading, not listening. Once again, it's concentrating on your own powers of interpretation instead of just hearing what people are saying and, for the moment at least, giving them the benefit of the doubt. The third obstacle to listening assertively is called filtering. Basically, it means perking up your ears when you hear something that interests you or that you agree with, and shutting your attention down to the rest. A big part of all conversation, whether business or personal, is about establishing a sense of complicity or shared interest with the other person. If that sense of sharing interest or agreement isn't forthcoming, there's a tendency to discount what someone is saying. Furthermore, if the speaker indicates an interest in something you're absolutely not interested in at all, you may even decide to tune that person out completely. If someone tells you that he attends NASCAR events every weekend and owns a pit bull, you may devalue his ideas for your business simply because you're a vegetarian and never touch synthetic fibers. The NASCAR fan may have some excellent ideas on marketing strategy, but you'll never know. Beyond these three barriers, there are many, many more. Lots of people are judgmental. They decide a statement is crazy, boring, immature, or hostile, even before it's completed. Other people have a therapeutic approach to conversation, silently drafting their prescriptions and advice throughout the dialogue. Perhaps you experience every conversation as an intellectual debate with the goal of defeating the opponent. Maybe you're convinced that you're always right about business issues, so what's the point of listening? If you're afraid of having a serious conversation, you might keep making jokes in order to keep things light. Or for the same reason, you may just keep agreeing with the person in order to remain safely in your comfort zone. As you heard these obstacles to assertive listening, there's an excellent chance that you saw yourself in at least some of them. That's good, because there's no way to change a behavior until you first know that it exists. Because of these and other barriers, people typically recall only 65% of conversation 20 minutes after it's taken place. Assertive listening isn't easy. It's not even natural, in the way that the obstacles we've just looked at are natural expressions of interpersonal psychology. Our concentration lasts only a short time before we get distracted. This happens to everyone, but assertive listeners make an effort to get back on track. They ask clarifying questions, and they reassure the speaker that the message is being heard and understood. Above all, assertive listeners guard against prejudices, close-minded opinions, and inner defenses that prevent us from hearing what is really being said. To keep this from happening, remember something that Mark Twain once wrote. If we were supposed to talk more than we listen, we'd have 2 mouths and 1 ear. As you listen, you must also respond. Why? So that you can listen some more. Of course, even poor listeners respond in one way or another, but there's a wide spectrum of responses that extends from outright hostility all the way to true empathy. Right now, let's take a quick look at that spectrum from bottom to top, from callous indifference to genuinely assertive listening. At the bottom of the listening scale, we find people who not only wish the topic would change, but who come right out and change it. Someone says, "I think we should have fewer meetings on Fridays," and the listener says, "How about those Mets?" One step up from this is the "I know better." The speaker says, "My computer crashed," and you say, "I doubt that. I'll take a look at it when I have time." Often the listener will add, or at least think, something further like, "You should have read the instruction manual," or "I can see that you're technologically challenged." An extension of this is the judgmental response. To a person who says he ate too much at lunch, you respond, "Obesity is a national disgrace, and it's driving up the cost of health insurance." This is an extreme example, of course, but the impulse to judge is very strong in many of us. Assertive listening demands that we take off our judicial robes, at least for the length of the conversation. Next comes the advising response, which is a less moralistic form of judgment. A colleague of yours tells you he's afraid to ask for a raise. Instead of responding to what he wants you to hear, that he is afraid, you tell him what to write in a memo to the boss. Or along the same lines, you could devalue what he's feeling under the guise of reassurance. You might say something like, "Oh, everybody gets nervous about asking for more money. Just don't let it get to you." In other words, "I don't want to hear any more about it." Once again, most of us are guilty of some of these unempathic responses. If this happened on only a few occasions, there would be no problem. But poor listening skills seem to be habit-forming. We become habitual topic changers or advisors. Of course, the best way to end a bad habit is not to suppress it, but to replace it with a good habit. So let's move up the scale of listening responses toward the positive and assertive options. The first of these is correct understanding of some of the other person's thoughts, feelings, or circumstances. That is, you hear some of what's being said or implied, but not yet all of it. If the speaker picks up on this, it may discourage him or her from saying anything further. Since this limited understanding is often an unconscious process on the part of the listener, it's important to train yourself to ask for clarification and elaboration, even if you don't think it's really necessary. Don't assume that you've heard everything you need to know. In fact, assume the opposite. Above this response level, we begin to approach really assertive listening. Now you respond with genuine empathy. You really put yourself in another person's shoes. Your comments reflect what the speaker has told you. As you listen, your comments are brief and accurate. You paraphrase and mirror what you've heard, but you do so in your own words, in a way that seems respectful and natural. As a result, the speaker knows you are listening closely and that you care about what you hear. All this takes some real skill and technique. It's best, for example, to phrase your comments somewhat tentatively, because empathy questions are actually statements. When you ask, "Are you feeling down?" you're really saying, "I can see that you're sad about something." Even when you're slightly off the mark, a tentative approach gives the speaker a chance to set their record straight and get you precisely in tune. For this reason, it's important to make frequent comments that reflect your understanding of what's just been said. If the speaker gets no comment from you for 2 or 3 minutes, he or she may conclude that you've lost interest, or disapprove of what you're hearing, or don't understand it. As you become more experienced and adept with assertive listening, you'll reach a totally new level of response. Here, something amazing will really happen. You'll often be able to understand what people are thinking and feeling even before they themselves know it. In fact, you can help them to gain that level of insight by the questions you ask. More often than not, they'll appreciate your feedback and will embrace your interpretation and analysis. As an assertive listener, you'll know exactly when to present your ideas in this way, and it's not something you'll want to do too soon. If you give an interpretation too quickly, it may seem too personal, critical, or premature. So once again, it's wise to be tentative. Phrases like, "I'm wondering if," or "It sounds to me like," can be very useful. Genuinely assertive listeners can often share insights that are not just useful, but are positively life-transforming. Dale Carnegie was certainly such a listener, and the tools and techniques he mastered have been brought to the world through his books and audio programs. You may wonder whether you can ever achieve that level of people skills, but don't worry. Nothing that Dale Carnegie accomplished is out of your reach, and that's especially true in the area of listening and assertive communication. So to complete this session, let's sum up some of the central points of this topic. These are basic listening techniques you can use to improve your assertive communication skills. Remember, for example, that paraphrasing is a good way to show the speaker that you've really listened. It will often foster better understanding on your part, while also showing the speaker that you value what he or she is saying. When there's a natural pause in the conversation, state briefly what you heard your partner say by rephrasing in your own words. Then ask if this is correct. Ask questions and get clarification on anything you don't quite understand. Asking your people to explain their feelings helps draw them out to be more open. Make sure you understand what you've heard before you react to what's been said. Remember, both you and the speaker are probably unaware of the subjective filtering process that takes place in your talk, so be sure to ask for clarification even when you don't think you really need it. As you listen assertively, you should also be assertive about giving feedback. Feedback is simply telling the speaker your reaction to what you've heard. Make it clear that this feedback is based on your understanding of what has been said, and if the feedback is negative in any way, be sure to add that your understanding might need adjustment. And always bear in mind 3 key rules for feedback in any business conversation. It must be immediate, it must be honest, and while it can be negative in content, it must always be emotionally supportive and never mean-spirited or aggressive. Be aware of body language. Up to 90% of interpersonal communication is visual. You're receiving not only words, but also posture and what's called social distance. How close is the other person standing to you? And is he looking towards you or away from you? Most often, body language prevails over words. Position yourself in a way that suggests empathy, openness, and attention. Nod your head occasionally as you listen, and maintain eye contact to show interest. Some people feel that nods and eye contact from the listener help them feel heard. Others find this body language distracting and prefer the listener to be still and attentive. Use your own judgment as to what makes a particular speaker feel comfortable. If you sense a discrepancy between what is explicitly being said and what you see, ask for clarification. Be aware that interruptions, advice, or judgmental questions are all barriers to assertive listening. In the context of friendship or a personal conversation, relating a similar story to what you've heard is acceptable. But in a business conversation, it can be distracting and is usually an example of playing topper. If you find yourself saying, "That reminds me of the time that," resist the temptation to go on. In any case, sincerity is the most crucial element in all human communication, whether as a speaker or a listener. Most people are able to accept a broad range of styles in a listener, provided that your attention is truly present and directed toward them. As an assertive listener, you must learn to validate every person's experience, regardless of your own beliefs or convictions. This doesn't mean that you have to agree with everyone. It does mean that you will hear and accept their impressions, letting go of your personal reactions and bringing attention always back to what's being said to you. This is a crucial people skill for all managers. At some point in the conversation, once a trusting relationship is well established, you can indicate that your own experience, or that of others, has led you to a different conclusion. But even as you do this, it's vital to stress at the same time that you hear the speaker's experience and the convictions that come from it. Don't feel that you have to elaborate on your own position in great detail. Even if you're asked to do so, it's a good idea to suggest that that might be the subject of another conversation, but that right now you'd prefer to listen to what your team member had to say. Very often, when a junior person asks for the manager to take over the conversation, it's really a way for the subordinate to back off and avoid confronting what he or she really wanted to say. Don't go for that gambit, even if the other person seems to want you to talk. Assertive listening can be a transforming factor in the relationship between a manager and a team member. People who have felt threatened or devalued can get the sense that they're truly unique and valuable, perhaps for the first time. If conflict is developed, this can be a chance for both sides to learn about one another as colleagues, human beings, and even potential friends. In general, our society generally doesn't teach assertive listening skills. We usually operate on a confrontational model of debate and reasoned argument rather than on a model of listening carefully to everyone and arriving at understanding and respect. Our paradigm is, the best idea will win, not everyone has something to contribute to the best solution, which has probably not yet been thought of. It's important to note that both the confrontational model and that of assertive listening are a search for truth. They're simply different approaches, but in terms of people skills, the combative approach will invariably leave someone behind and may well sow seeds for future conflict. In this sense, assertive listening can be not only a peacemaking process, but a peacekeeping process as well. It's been said that an adversary is someone whose story we haven't heard yet. Once you truly hear someone else's experience and understand their fears and aspirations, you will be unable to consider that person as anything but an ally. You may disagree with them or even find their position directly contradictory to your own, but you will still see them as a contributor to a shared enterprise and as a valuable human being. As Dale Carnegie put it, "Thus you must learn to listen as well as to speak. Those who dismiss this as a mere platitude are already demonstrating an indisposition to listening." The phrase may be trite, but the message is hugely significant to your effectiveness as a manager. If you do not explicitly develop the skill of listening, you may not hear the secret which can launch you to fame and fortune.